I walked into the elite cattle auction and my brother's fiancée whispered with a cruel smile, "You should not have come. The help ruins the prestige." She did not know I was the sole heir to the ranch where she and her entire family lived, nor that they would be evicted before the final gavel fell. My name is Zara, and at 32 years old I learned that silence is the loudest form of revenge. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The scent of expensive leather and old money filled the air of the Texas Grand Hall. This was the event of the season, the annual elite cattle auction where millions changed hands over a handshake and a nod. I adjusted the lapel of my black tailored suit and stepped onto the red carpet. My heels clicked against the marble floor with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. I was not here to socialize. I was here to execute a judgment. Before I could reach the VIP entrance, a hand with manicured white claws shot out to block my path. It was Tiffany, my cousin Darius's fiancée. She was draped in a white sequined dress that cost more than the annual salary of our ranch hands. Her blue eyes scanned me up and down with a mixture of disgust and amusement. "Oh, Zara," she said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "I think you are confused, honey. The catering staff entrance is around the back near the dumpsters. We really cannot have you walking through the front door. It confuses the investors." I stopped and looked her dead in the eye. My expression remained flat. I did not blink. I did not flinch. Tiffany laughed, a high-pitched sound that grated on my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. She turned to the security guard standing next to her, a large man who looked uncomfortable. "Earl, check her purse," she said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "You know how these people get around free food? We do not want her stuffing shrimp into her pockets to take home to that barn she lives in." The guests nearby stopped their conversations. I felt their eyes on me. Some looked pitying. Others looked annoyed that a scene was causing a delay. The guard hesitated, looking from Tiffany to me. I simply held out my small black clutch. "Go ahead," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Search it. But when you find nothing, you might want to ask yourself why the future mistress of Brooks Ranch is afraid of a woman she claims is a nobody." Tiffany's smile faltered for a second, but she quickly recovered. "Do not be dramatic, Zara. I am just protecting Darius's assets. After all, today is about the future, and you are just a sad reminder of the past." "Tiffany. Darling, what is the holdup?" The voice boomed from behind us. "Darius, my cousin and the self-proclaimed king of this cattle empire." He strolled up with a glass of scotch in one hand and an arrogance that filled the entire room. He kissed Tiffany on the cheek before finally acknowledging my existence. He looked at me not with hatred, but with something far worse. Boredom. "Zara," he sighed, shaking his head. "I thought I told the security team to keep the riffraff out. We have serious investors here today. We cannot have you looking like that." He gestured vaguely at my outfit with his drink, sending a few amber droplets onto the pristine floor. The crowd around us had gone silent. They were watching the Brooks family drama unfold like a live theater performance. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, not from shame, but from a simmering rage that I had been suppressing for 5 years. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply watched him perform his little power play. Darius chuckled, looking at his watch. "Look, I get it. Times are tough since Granddad passed, and the gravy train stopped. You are probably here looking for a handout, or hoping to beg for your old job back." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a crisp money clip. With a theatrical flick of his wrist, he peeled off a single $100 bill. He did not hand it to me. He let it flutter from his fingers. The green paper drifted through the air in slow motion, twirling lazily before landing on the cold marble floor right between my boots. "There. That should cover an Uber back to the city," he said with a smirk that mirrored Tiffany's. "Go buy yourself a decent meal, maybe get that suit dry cleaned. Just do it somewhere else. You are embarrassing the brand. Tiffany giggled, covering her mouth with her hand. Oh, Darius, you are too generous with her. She does not deserve your kindness. The security guard took a step forward, expecting me to scramble for the cash like a desperate animal. For a second, I saw the expectation in everyone's eyes. They expected the poor disinherited cousin to break. They expected tears. They expected me to bend the knee. Slowly, I bent down. I reached for the bill. I heard Darius snort a laugh, but as I stood up, I did not put the money in my pocket. I turned to a young waiter who had been freezing in the background, holding a tray of champagne. I walked over to him and tucked the $100 bill into his breast pocket. Thank you for your service, I said loud enough for the circle of onlookers to hear. Dealing with trash must be exhausting. Keep the change. I turned back to Darius, whose smile had frozen on his face. His eyes darted from the waiter to me, realizing that his insult had just bounced off an invisible armor. I did not wait for his response. I stepped past him, bumping his shoulder hard enough to make the ice clink in his glass, and walked straight toward the main auction hall. I could hear Tiffany gasping behind me, but I did not look back. I had just spent $100 of his money to buy back my dignity. And the night was only just beginning. I smoothed out my jacket, erasing the memory of Darius's shoulder against mine. The general admission floor was a different world from the VIP balcony, but the smell of money was just as pungent. I moved through the crowd, a speck of ink in a sea of cream linen and cowboy hats. Being a Black woman in this specific circle of Texas high society usually meant you were either serving the drinks or cleaning up after the party. To see me standing there holding a glass of water and wearing a suit that was clearly tailored triggered a visible confusion in the eyes of the people I passed. I drifted toward the bar, keeping my head down. My goal was to be invisible, to blend into the background noise while I gathered intelligence. Voices floated over the rim of crystal glasses, and the hum of conversation was thick with rumors. I stopped near a high-top table where two cattle brokers in expensive Stetsons were leaning in close. I give the Brooks place 6 months tops, one of them muttered, swirling his bourbon. The boy is selling off acreage like it is going out of style. Old Otis must be rolling in his grave. His companion nodded grimly. I heard he is leveraging the livestock to pay for that fiancé's renovations, selling breeding stock for quick cash. It is a damn tragedy. I took a sip of water to hide the smirk threatening to form on my lips. They were right. Darius was cannibalizing the legacy my grandfather spent 50 years building, just to fund Tiffany's delusions of grandeur. But hearing it confirmed by the market experts gave me a cold satisfaction. Zara. Is that you? The voice was gravelly and familiar. I turned to see Mr. Henderson, a cattle broker, who had sat at my grandfather's kitchen table for 30 years. He looked older now, his face weathered like worn saddle leather. He looked at me with the soft, dewy eyes of pity. The look people reserve for injured stray dogs or children who have lost their parents. Mr. Henderson, I said, nodding respectfully. It is good to see you. He sighed, shaking his head, as he looked up at the VIP balcony where Darius was loudly toasting with a group of investors. It is a damn shame, girl. A damn shame. Otis told me once you had the best eye for livestock he had ever seen. For you to be left with nothing while that boy turns the ranch into a circus? Well, it just does not sit right with me. He reached out and patted my arm awkwardly. I felt a lump form in my throat. Mr. Henderson was one of the few people who actually respected me for my work, not my pedigree. But I could not tell him the truth. Not yet. I am managing Mr. Henderson. I lied, my voice steady. Granddad left me his books, so I have plenty to read. He chuckled sadly, misinterpreting my words. Books do not put food on the table, Zara. Listen, if you need a reference for a job, you call me. Okay, I know folks looking for administrative help. Do not let pride starve you. I forced a smile. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I will keep that in mind. I watched him walk away, shaking his head. He saw a tragedy. He saw a disinherited granddaughter grasping for crumbs. I saw a strategy. Being invisible gave me power. No one guards their secrets around the help or the destitute. Standing there amidst the whispers of the ranch's demise, I felt a cold resolve harden in my chest. They were all mourning the Brooks legacy, unaware that the true heir was standing right beside them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. A sharp feedback whine pierced the air, drawing every eye in the room toward the stage. Darius stood behind the podium, tapping the microphone with a gold ring that shone under the spotlight. He cleared his throat and flashed that practiced politician's smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us on this historic evening." Beside him, Tiffany beamed, waving to the crowd like she was royalty acknowledging her subjects. She rested a possessive hand on the heavy velvet rope that separated the stage from the common folk. "Welcome to the future of Brooks Ranch." Darius boomed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "For 3 generations, my family has worked this land, but tradition without innovation is just a dead weight. Today we are not just selling cattle, we are shedding the old skin to make way for a luxury destination that will put Texas on the map." He paused for applause and the VIP section erupted in polite clapping while the old ranchers around me stayed silent, their arms crossed. I raised the plastic cup of lukewarm Merlot to my lips. It tasted acidic and cheap, a fitting pairing for the bile rising in my throat. I watched my cousin parade around up there, wearing a cowboy hat that had never seen a day of sweat or dust. He spoke of the land like it was a line item on a spreadsheet. He spoke of our grandfather Otis Brooks as if he were honoring him. My grandfather Otis built this empire with nothing but grit and a refusal to quit. Darius continued, placing a hand over his heart. "And I know if he were here today watching us pivot toward this lucrative hospitality venture, he would be proud. He would say, 'Darius, well done, son.' The lie was so audacious that I almost choked on my wine. Proud." The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I gripped the plastic cup until it cracked. Darius did not know pride, he only knew price tags. He talked about legacy, but the only thing he actually inherited was greed. He had no idea what grandfather Otis would have actually said, because he was never there when it mattered. He was not there for the early mornings. He was not there for the hard winters. And he certainly was not there at the end. The sounds of the auction hall began to fade into a dull roar. The bright lights of the chandeliers blurred, stretching and distorting until they looked like distant headlights in the rain. The smell of expensive perfume and roasted beef evaporated, replaced by the scent of wet earth and lilies. The applause turned into the sound of rain hitting a black umbrella. My vision tunneled, darkening around the edges as the present moment dissolved. I was no longer standing in the back of a gala. I was back where the nightmare truly began. 4 weeks ago, standing in the mud, looking down at a mahogany casket that held the only person who had ever loved me. The bright lights of the auction hall dissolved into the slate-gray sky of a Texas winter. Rain fell in sheets, turning the rich soil of the family plot into a thick, clinging mud. I stood at the edge of the open grave, my black umbrella trembling in my hand. They lowered grandfather Otis into the ground, the only father I had ever known. The man who taught me how to ride a horse before I could walk and how to read a balance sheet before I could drive. My chest felt hollowed out, like someone had reached inside and removed my heart, leaving only a cold, aching void. To my left, the sound of a camera shutter clicked repeatedly, breaking the sacred silence. I turned my head slightly. Tiffany was holding her phone at a high angle, pouting her lips in a practiced expression of sorrow. She snapped 3 photos in rapid succession before immediately scrolling to check the lighting. "Ugh," she whispered loud enough to be heard over the preacher's prayer. "This lighting washes me out completely. And look at these boots, Darius. The mud is going to stain the suede. You owe me a new pair." Darius did not even look up from his own screen. He was leaning against a tombstone, scrolling through a football forum. "Relax, babe," he muttered. "Once the old man's accounts settle, I will buy you 10 pairs. Just give it a week. He looked at his watch and sighed dramatically. Hey, Reverend, can we speed this up? Some of us have lives to get back to. He did not look at the casket. He did not look at me. He looked through us, focusing only on the future that he believed belonged to him. I looked for comfort from Auntie Patrice, my father's sister. Surely she felt the weight of losing the patriarch. But when I spotted her, she was standing under the funeral home's large canopy protected from the rain. She was not holding a handkerchief. She was holding the condolence box stuffed with envelopes of cash and checks from well-wishers. Her fingers moved with the dexterity of a bank teller, thumbing the corners of the envelopes, estimating the thickness. She caught my eye and her face hardened. Do not look at me like that, Zara, she hissed across the short distance. Someone has to make sure the family is provided for since you were too busy crying to greet the guests properly. I turned back to the grave as the first shovel of dirt hit the mahogany wood with a dull thud. It was the loneliest sound in the world. At that moment, I realized I was not just burying my grandfather. I was burying my protection. The buffer between me and the wolves had vanished, and they were already circling, licking their chops, waiting for the reading of the will to tear me apart. 3 days after the funeral, we gathered in grandfather's study for the reading of the will. The room still smelled of his pipe tobacco and old leather, but the atmosphere was thick with tension. Mr. Sterling, the family attorney, sat behind the massive oak desk that had been my grandfather's command center for 40 years. He was sweating. Beads of perspiration had formed on his upper lip, and he refused to make eye contact with me. That was my first clue that a crime was about to be committed right in front of my face. Auntie Patrice sat on the edge of the sofa, clutching her handbag with white-knuckled intensity. Darius was sprawled in grandfather's favorite armchair, looking bored, while Tiffany examined her cuticles next to him. We are here to execute the final wishes of Otis Brooks, Mr. Sterling announced. He reached into his briefcase. I expected him to pull out the thick blue binder that held the estate trust we had discussed months ago. Instead, he produced a single sheet of yellow legal pad paper. This document was found in Mr. Brooks's nightstand the morning he passed. Mr. Sterling said, his voice wavering slightly. It is a handwritten codicil dated 2 days before his death. It supersedes all previous wills. I sat up straight, my heart hammering against my ribs. A handwritten note. You cannot be serious. Grandfather was meticulous. He would never draft a legal document on scratch paper. And 2 days before he died, he could barely hold a spoon, let alone write a legible sentence. Hush, Zara. Auntie Patrice snapped. Let the man read. Otis was not in his right mind at the end. We all know he made sudden decisions. Sterling cleared his throat and began to read. To my grandson Darius, whom I trust to carry on the Brooks name and legacy, I leave the entirety of the Brooks Ranch estate. This includes the deed to the 500 acres, the main residence, the livestock, and all liquid assets in the operating accounts. Darius let out a low whistle and pumped his fist. Jackpot, he whispered. Tiffany squealed and immediately began typing on her phone, likely searching for contractors to remodel the kitchen. And what about Zara? I asked, my voice cutting through their celebration. I ran this place. I managed the herds. I was the one holding his hand when he took his last breath. Sterling looked down at the paper. To my granddaughter Zara, I leave the contents of the old storage barn library. Specifically, the collection of vintage agricultural journals and books contained therein. The silence that followed was heavy. Then Darius burst out laughing, a cruel barking sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. Books. He left you dusty old books. He leaned forward, his eyes dancing with malice. Well, look on the bright side, cousin. It is going to be a cold winter in Texas. At least now you have plenty of paper to start a fire. You can burn your inheritance to keep warm while you watch me spend mine. I looked at the lawyer. Mr. Sterling, you know this is a forgery. Grandfather's handwriting was shaky from Parkinson's. This script is smooth, confident, It looks remarkably like Darius's handwriting. Sterling slammed his briefcase shut. It is notarized, Zara. It is legal. Unless you have $50,000 to retain a forensic handwriting expert and challenge this in probate court, I suggest you accept your inheritance. You have 24 hours to move your boxes of books out of the main house. I stood up. My hands were shaking, but I hid them behind my back. They thought they had stripped me of everything. They thought they had won. But they did not know grandfather. He never did anything without a reason. And they had no idea what was actually hidden inside those books. The ink on the forged will was barely dry when the invasion began. At 7 in the morning, a convoy of pristine white moving trucks rolled down the gravel driveway, kicking up dust clouds that choked the morning air. I watched from the kitchen window as Tiffany marched out onto the porch wearing a silk robe and wielding a latte like a scepter. She was not wasting a single second. To her, this was not a home filled with generations of memories. It was a renovation project she needed to sanitize. I stepped outside just as two movers were hauling out the massive mahogany dining table. That table was more than furniture. My great-grandfather had carved it by hand from a tree that fell on this land during the storm of 1920. Every scratch on its surface told a story of a family dinner, a holiday gathering, or a business deal that kept this ranch afloat. "Careful," I shouted instinctively, stepping forward. "That table is over 100 years old." Tiffany spun around, pulling her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose. "Oh, good, you are awake. Tell them to just toss it in the dumpster around back. It is too heavy to donate, and honestly, it smells like old people and dirt. We are going for a modern minimalist farmhouse vibe. You know, clean lines, lots of white." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You cannot be serious. That table is an antique. It is part of this ranch's history. You cannot just throw it away like garbage." Tiffany laughed a dry, humorless sound. "History is just another word for clutter, Zara. And this place is full of it. Look at these drapes. Heavy, dark, depressing. And that paneling in the hallway. It makes the place look like a dungeon. I have painters coming in an hour. We are painting everything eggshell white. Bright, airy, expensive." She turned back to the movers, snapping her fingers. "Keep moving, boys. Anything that looks like it belongs in a museum or a haunted house goes in the trash. I want this living room cleared by noon." I watched in horror as they dragged the table across the porch, leaving a deep scratch in the wood. Then came the leather armchairs where grandfather used to read to me. Then the hand-woven rugs brought back from trips to the motherland. Piece by piece, they stripped the soul out of the house. It was not just a renovation, it was an erasure. Tiffany was systematically bleaching away every trace of my family's identity, replacing our rich heritage with sterile mass-produced furniture that looked like it came from a catalog. Darius stepped out onto the porch, yawning and scratching his stomach. He looked at the pile of heirlooms growing in the yard and shrugged. "Let her do what she wants, Zara. A happy wife means a happy life. Besides, this old junk is depressing. It is time for an upgrade." I stood there trembling, not from cold, but from a rage so hot it threatened to consume me. They were throwing away priceless artifacts like they were fast food wrappers. I realized then that they did not see the value in anything they could not spend. They were hollow people trying to fill a historic home with their own emptiness. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. I turned and walked away toward the barn before I did something that would get me arrested. Let them paint the walls white. They could never scrub away the truth of who really owned this land. The ultimatum was delivered over breakfast the next morning. Darius sat at the head of the table in grandfather's chair, which looked comically large for him. He was picking at a plate of imported smoked salmon that he had ordered specially from the city, while Tiffany scrolled through color swatches for the new nursery. They did not offer me a plate. I stood by the door holding my coffee mug, feeling like an intruder in the home where I had taken my first steps. Darius wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and finally acknowledged me. Zara, we have been reviewing the household expenses, and frankly, your presence here is a financial drain. We cannot support a grown woman who contributes nothing to the new vision of Brooks Ranch. I set my mug down slowly. Contributes nothing. Darius. I manage the breeding schedules. I handle the veterinary rotations. I keep this ranch profitable while you sleep until noon. He waved his hand dismissively. That is old school thinking. We are pivoting to hospitality, remember? Which brings me to the point. Tiffany needs your bedroom. She intends to convert it into a walk-in closet for her shoe collection. The lighting in there is simply better. I felt the air leave my lungs. You are kicking me out. Not kicking you out, cousin. Just relocating you. Darius smirked. There is the old tack room behind the storage barn. It has 4 walls and a roof. It is perfectly adequate, and if you want to stay on the property, you will need to earn your keep. But not as a manager. I am taking over operations. You can stay on as a general laborer. Mucking stalls, feeding the stock, minimum wage. Rent will be deducted from your paycheck, of course. Tiffany looked up from her phone and giggled. Think of it as a demotion with benefits, Zara. You love those smelly cows so much now you get to sleep with them. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to throw my coffee in his face and leave, to walk away and let him drive the ranch into the ground. But then I thought about the herd. I thought about the pregnant heifers that were due in a month. I thought of Big Ben, the prize bull, who required a specific diet that only I knew how to mix. If I left, Darius would neglect them. They would get sick. They would die. The legacy grandfather built would rot from the inside out. I took a deep breath, forcing the rage down into the pit of my stomach, where it could fuel me later. Fine, I said. I will take the job. And the room. Darius looked disappointed. He wanted a fight. He wanted me to quit. Good, he grunted. You start immediately. Get your boxes out of the main house by sunset. That night I lay on a cot in the drafty tack room. The air smelled of hay and manure. Through the cracks in the wooden walls I could see the main house up on the hill. It was blazing with light, every window glowing warmly against the dark Texas sky. I could hear music drifting down the hill. They were celebrating their victory. But as I pulled the thin wool blanket tighter around my shoulders, I knew something they did not. I was not just a laborer sleeping in the barn. I was a spy behind enemy lines, and from down here in the dark I could see everything. The wind howled outside the thin wooden walls of the tack room, rattling the loose window pane. My new home was little more than a shed, but it was the only shelter I had. I sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor, surrounded by the cardboard boxes that Darius had thrown out of the main house. These were the useless books he had mocked. The agricultural journals dating back to the 1950s, the handwritten herd records, and grandfather's personal library. To Darius, they were just kindling for a fire. To me, they were the only connection I had left to the man who raised me. I reached into the bottom of the last box and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound King James Bible. The cover was worn smooth from decades of use, and the gold lettering on the spine had faded. Grandfather used to read from this book every Sunday morning before we went out to check the fences. It was a ritual, a moment of peace before the hard work began. I ran my hand over the cover, feeling a pang of grief so sharp it almost doubled me over. I opened it intending to find solace in the Psalms. Instead, I felt resistance. The book did not lay flat. There was something thick wedged between the pages of the Book of Job. I frowned and turned the pages carefully. Taped securely to the inner binding was a thick manila envelope. It was not there by accident. Grandfather was a man of precision. He did not leave things to chance. I carefully peeled the tape away, my heart pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. On the front of the envelope, in Grandfather's shaky but distinct handwriting, were the words, "For Zara. Open when the wolves are at the door. The wolves are definitely here. Grandfather," I whispered to the empty room. My hands trembled as I slid the contents out. It was not a sentimental letter. It was a legal document. A thick stack of papers stamped with the blue seal of a prestigious law firm in Houston. I squinted in the dim light of the single bulb hanging overhead, trying to make sense of the dense legal jargon. Declaration of Trust. The Zara Brooks Irrevocable Legacy Trust. I scanned the pages, my eyes widening with every line. My breath hitched in my throat. I flipped to the schedule of assets attached to the back. Listed there in black and white was everything: the deed to the 500 acres, the livestock brand rights, the operating LLC, the mineral rights. I read the date. Grandfather had transferred ownership of the entire estate into this trust 5 years ago. He had made me the sole beneficiary and the trustee. The will that Darius was waving around was worthless. It was a piece of paper with no legal standing because at the time of his death, Grandfather technically owned nothing. The trust owned it all. And I owned the trust. I sat back against the cold wooden wall, clutching the documents to my chest. A laugh bubbled up in my throat, a wild, hysterical laugh that I had to smother with my hand to keep from waking the horses. Darius was not the owner. He was a squatter. Every decision he made, every wall he painted, every cow he sold, he was doing it on my land. Grandfather had played the long game. He knew Darius was greedy. He knew Auntie Patrice was weak. He knew they would try to cut me out. So he let them think they had won. He gave them enough rope, knowing they would eventually hang themselves with it. I looked out the dusty window at the main house on the hill. The lights were still blazing. They were up there drinking my wine, sitting on my furniture, planning how to spend my money. Let them celebrate, I whispered into the darkness. Enjoy the party, Darius, because the eviction notice is already sitting in my lap. I stared at my reflection in the jagged piece of mirror hanging on the tack room wall. The woman looking back at me was unrecognizable. Her eyes were red and swollen, and her face was streaked with dust and tears. But as I clutched the trust documents against my chest, something shifted behind my eyes. The grief evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, smearing the dirt, but clearing my vision. The sad, grieving granddaughter died in that barn that night. What rose from the ashes was the CEO of Brooks Ranch, and I was done playing the victim. The next morning I called in sick. It was the first time in 10 years I had missed a day of work. While Darius and Tiffany slept off their hangover, I drove my battered pickup truck 2 hours into the heart of Houston. I pulled up to a glass skyscraper that pierced the clouds, a stark contrast to the mud and manure I had left behind. I was there to see Marcus Thorne. He was not a family lawyer. He was a corporate shark known for tearing apart mergers and acquisitions with surgical precision. I sat in his office, placing the yellowed envelope on his glass desk. Thorne read through the documents in silence. For 20 minutes, the only sound was the turning of pages and the hum of the air conditioner. Finally, he looked up, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. "This is ironclad, Zara," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Your grandfather was a genius. He created an irrevocable trust 5 years ago. Technically speaking, Darius and your aunt have been squatting on your property since the moment Otis took his last breath. We can have the sheriff throw them out by sunset." I felt a surge of triumph. "Do it," I said. "I want them gone." Thorne held up a hand. "We can do that. But if we evict them now, they just leave. They go back to their lives complaining about how you stole their inheritance. They play the victim. Is that what you want? Or do you want to make sure they can never hurt anyone again?" I hesitated. "What do you mean?" Thorne leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "You told me Darius is planning to liquidate assets. He wants to sell the prize bull and parcels of land to pay his gambling debts." "Yes," I replied. "He is planning an auction in a few weeks." "Let him," Thorne said softly. "If he attempts to sell the land, that is just a mistake. But if he accepts a deposit, if he signs a contract and accepts a wire transfer for property he does not own, that is no longer a civil dispute. That is federal wire fraud. That is grand larceny. That is a mandatory prison sentence. I sat back, stunned by the magnitude of his plan. You want me to let them sell my grandfather's legacy? I want you to let them dig their own graves, Thorne corrected. You have the documents to stop the sale at the very last second. Let them spend the money in their heads. Let them commit the crime on public record. Then we dropped the hammer. I looked out the window at the city below, thinking of Tiffany throwing away the dining table and Darius mocking my poverty. I did not just want them out of my house, I wanted justice. I turned back to Thorne and nodded. Let us do it, I said. I will go back. I will shovel their manure. I will let them treat me like dirt. And I will wait for the moment they sign their freedom away. Driving back to the ranch, I felt a strange sense of calm. I pulled into the driveway just as the sun was setting. The lights of the main house were on, and I could see Tiffany's silhouette in the window drinking wine. I parked my truck, walked into the barn, and put on my dirty coveralls. I was ready to play my part in their tragedy. The decline of Brooks Ranch did not happen all at once. It happened in agonizing slow motion. 2 weeks after I was banished to the barn, a cherry-red sports car roared up the gravel driveway. It was a brand-new Porsche glistening under the Texas sun like a fresh wound. Darius stepped out wearing designer sunglasses, looking like he had just won the lottery. In his mind, he had. But while he was polishing his new toy, the heartbeat of the ranch was beginning to falter. I was in the feed shed when the delivery truck arrived. For 30 years, Grandfather had ordered a custom blend of high-protein grain and mineral supplements essential for maintaining the muscle mass of our prize-winning herd. When the driver began unloading sacks of generic filler, mostly corn husks and sawdust, I ran out to stop him. There must be a mistake, I said, grabbing the manifest. This is grade D feed. This is what you feed cattle before slaughter, not breeding stock. The driver shrugged. Just following orders, lady. Mr. Brooks called and changed the order last week, said he wanted the cheapest option available. I stormed up to the main house, my boots caked in mud. Darius was on the porch admiring his reflection in the car window. You changed the feed, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You are feeding them garbage, Darius. These animals are not just pets. They are high-performance athletes. If you cut their nutrition, their coats will dull, their weight will drop, and their immune systems will crash. Darius laughed, wiping a smudge off his fender. Relax, Zara. They are cows. They eat grass. I am not spending $10,000 a month on gourmet meals for animals that stand in their own filth. Besides, I needed to free up some cash flow for the down payment on this beauty. It fits the new image of the ranch, do you not think? I looked at the car, then back at the pastures. You are trading millions in future livestock value for a car that will depreciate the moment you drive it off the lot. You are killing them. You are being dramatic, he snapped. Get back to work. If I hear one more complaint, I will dock your pay. Within days, the silence of the ranch was broken by a new sound. Coughing. Deep, dry, hacking coughs that echoed from the stalls at night. I watched helplessly as Big Ben, the 2,000-pound bull, who was the cornerstone of our breeding program, began to lose his shine. His ribs started to show through his hide. His eyes, once bright and alert, grew dull and lethargic. He was starving and he was sick. I could not let them suffer. Not for Grandfather and not for my own conscience. That night, while the lights of the main house blazed with another one of Tiffany's dinner parties, I slipped out in my truck. I drove 2 counties over to a vet supply store where the owner knew me. I drained my personal savings account buying crates of antibiotics, high-density nutrient blocks, and respiratory supplements. I returned under the cover of darkness like a thief on my own property. I parked behind the barn and hauled the heavy sacks by hand, my muscles burning with exertion. For the next 3 hours, I moved from stall to stall administering shots and hand-mixing the nutrients into their troughs. I am sorry, I whispered to Big Ben as I rubbed the medicine into his flank. I know you are hungry. I know it hurts. Just hold on a little longer. I did this every night for weeks. I was a ghost haunting the stables, fighting a silent war against Darius's negligence. I was exhausted, my bank account was empty, but every morning when I saw the herd standing a little stronger, I knew I was winning. Darius thought he was saving money, but he was only buying time until his house of cards collapsed. And I was the one keeping the foundation from crumbling until I was ready to pull the plug. The rain had turned the ground into a slurry of mud and manure that sucked at my boots with every step I took back from the stables. My hands smelled of antiseptic and horse liniment, but my spirit felt cleaner than it had in weeks. I had just managed to stabilize a calf with a respiratory infection, and for a moment I felt the ghost of my grandfather nodding in approval. But as I passed the rear patio of the main house, the sound of shattering glass froze me in my tracks. The light from the study spilled out onto the wet flagstones, casting long, distorted shadows. Grandfather's study was a sacred place, a place of quiet contemplation and business strategy. But tonight, it sounded like a bar fight. I stepped closer, pressing my back against the rough brick exterior until I was right next to the French doors. The curtains were drawn, but there was a sliver of a gap just wide enough to see through. I peered inside. Darius was pacing back and forth, his face slick with sweat, his expensive shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest. He looked like a cornered rat. He was gripping his phone so tightly I thought the screen might crack. "Listen to me, you bloodsucker!" Darius shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I told you I am good for it. Do not threaten me. Do not you dare threaten to call Tiffany. She knows nothing about this." I held my breath. The person on the other end of the line was obviously shouting back because Darius flinched, holding the phone away from his ear. $500,000, Darius hissed into the receiver. "I know how much it is. I know what I signed. But the Cowboys choked in the fourth quarter, okay? That was a sure bet. It was rigged. Gambling." I closed my eyes and shook my head. He had not just mismanaged the accounts. He was gambling away our heritage on sports bets. Darius stopped pacing and leaned heavily against the desk. "Listen, I have a solution. A permanent one. The engagement party is in 2 weeks. It is not just a party anymore. I am turning it into an exclusive auction. High rollers only." He paused, listening to the response, then nodded vigorously. "Yes. I am liquidating the assets. I am selling Big Ben." My heart stopped. Big Ben was not just a bull. He was a genetic masterpiece, the crowning achievement of grandfather's breeding program. Selling him to a slaughterhouse or a rival ranch was an act of treason. And the land, Darius continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The South Lot, the riverfront acreage. I have a developer lined up who wants to build condos. I will package the land deal with the livestock sale. You will get your $500,000 plus interest by the time the cake is cut. Just give me 2 weeks." He hung up the phone and hurled it onto the sofa. Then he walked over to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a glass of scotch with trembling hands. I pulled away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs like a war drum. He was going to sell Big Ben. He was going to carve up the land for condos. It was a desecration. But as the initial wave of panic subsided, a cold realization washed over me. Darius had just set the date for his own execution. He was going to sell property he did not own to pay a debt he could not afford. The engagement party. That was the deadline. That was the trap. I turned and disappeared back into the rainy night. I had 2 weeks to prepare the noose. The humiliation did not stop at the barn door. 2 days later, Tiffany decided to host a garden tea party for the junior league. She wanted to show off the renovations, or rather the destruction she had wreaked upon the homestead. I was mucking out the stalls when she appeared in the doorway holding a hanger covered in plastic. She did not step inside. She stood on the threshold, wrinkling her nose at the smell of honest work. "Zara, get cleaned up," she ordered, tossing the garment bag onto a bale of hay. "My friends are coming over and the catering service canceled last minute. I need you to serve. And put this on. We are going for a vintage Southern charm aesthetic, and your coveralls are ruining the vibe." I unzipped the bag. Inside was a gray polyester dress with a stiff white apron. It looked like a costume from a bad movie about the 1950s. It was not just a uniform. It was a caricature. It was designed to strip away my identity to reduce me from a Brooks to a prop in her fantasy. My hands clenched into fists, but I remembered the trust documents hidden under my mattress. I remembered the bigger picture. I took a shower, scrubbed the smell of the stables from my skin, and put on the dress. It was tight in the shoulders, and the fabric scratched my skin, but I held my head high. When I walked out onto the patio, the transformation was complete. Tiffany had set up round tables with white linens and elaborate floral centerpieces that probably cost more than a month of feed. 5 women sat around sipping mimosas and laughing. They were carbon copies of Tiffany, all blonde hair, expensive highlights, and predatory smiles. "Here she is," Tiffany announced, clapping her hands as I approached with a silver tray of cucumber sandwiches. "Ladies, meet Zara. She is Darius's cousin, but we are trying to teach her the value of hard work. She has been helping out around the house while she gets back on her feet." The women turned to look at me, their eyes glazed over with that specific brand of indifference reserved for the help. "Oh, Tiffany, you are such a saint," one of them cooed, taking a sandwich without looking at me. "Most families would have just cut her loose. It is so generous of you to give her a purpose." I moved around the table, pouring tea and refilling champagne flutes. My jaw was set so tight my teeth ached. I reached for the teapot to refill Tiffany's cup, but I hesitated for a fraction of a second, distracted by the sound of Darius's voice inside the house, shouting at someone on the phone. Tiffany noticed the hesitation. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the stone patio. She reached out and jabbed her manicured index finger hard into the center of my forehead. Her nail dug into my skin, leaving a sharp sting. "Hello," she snapped, pushing my head back with each word. "Is anyone in there? I said I wanted more ice. Do not just stand there daydreaming. Use your brain if you have one." The table went silent for a moment. Then one of the friends giggled. "Oh my God, Tiffany, she is so well trained. She did not even flinch. Where did you find her?" I stared at Tiffany, feeling the ghost of her finger on my forehead. The physical violation was small, but the intent was violent. She wanted me to break. She wanted me to cry or scream so she could play the victim. Instead, I slowly lowered the teapot. "I will get your ice." "Tiffany?" I said, my voice devoid of emotion. As I walked back to the kitchen, I heard them laughing again. They thought I was a broken woman. They did not know that every insult, every poke, and every degrading command was being added to a mental ledger. And the bill was coming due very soon. The bottle of 1996 Cabernet Sauvignon felt heavy in my hand as I moved toward the head of the table. It was one of the last bottles from grandfather's private reserve, a vintage he had been saving for my wedding day. Now Darius had cracked it open to impress a group of women who probably could not tell the difference between fine wine and grape juice. I approached Tiffany's chair, intending to refill her empty glass and retreat back to the safety of the kitchen. She was in the middle of a story about how difficult it was to find good help these days, her hands gesturing wildly. As I stepped forward, I saw her eyes flick toward my feet. A small, malicious smile played on her lips. In one fluid motion, she extended her leg, the heel of her Italian stiletto hooked around my ankle. It was subtle enough that no one else saw it, but deliberate enough to send me sprawling. Gravity took over instantly. My knees hit the stone patio with a sickening crunch, but I barely felt it. My eyes were locked on the bottle of wine as it flew from my grip. Time seemed to slow down. The bottle did not break immediately. It spun through the air, a dark missile headed straight for its target. The cork had been removed, and a thick arc of deep red liquid sprayed outward like a severed artery. The wine hit Tiffany first, splashing across her chest and soaking into the delicate white lace of her dress. Then the bottle struck the edge of the table and shattered, sending shards of glass and the remaining liter of red wine cascading into her lap. The silence that followed was absolute. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the drip, drip, drip of wine falling from the tablecloth onto the patio stones. Tiffany looked down at herself. The dress, which she had bragged cost $3,000, was ruined. It looked like a crime scene. A crimson stain blossomed across her stomach, turning the pristine fabric into a soggy mess. Then the screaming started. "You clumsy cow!" Tiffany shrieked, jumping up and knocking her chair backward. "Look at me! Look at what you did!" I scrambled to my knees, ignoring the pain in my legs. "I am so sorry, Tiffany. I slipped," I began to say, even though I knew the truth. She did not let me finish. She stepped forward, her face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She pulled her hand back and swung. The slap connected with my cheek with a force that snapped my head to the side. The sound was sharp and loud, like a pistol crack echoing across the garden. My ear rang, and I tasted the metallic tang of blood where my tooth had cut my inner cheek. I stayed on the ground, hand cupped over my stinging face, staring at the hem of her ruined dress. I waited for Darius to step in. I waited for him to defend his family. I waited for him to show even a shred of decency. From the doorway, I heard a low rumble that grew into a guffaw. Darius was leaning against the doorframe, holding his stomach, laughing so hard he was breathless. "That is priceless," he wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. "You look like you just walked out of a horror movie, babe. And Zara, you really are worthless, aren't you? Cannot even pour a drink without causing a disaster." The other women at the table chuckled nervously, taking their cues from Darius. I looked up at them from the ground. My cheek was throbbing, but my mind was crystal clear. That slap was the final payment. She had marked me physically, but I had just marked her fate financially. I slowly began to pick up the shards of glass with my bare hands, not caring if they cut me. Every drop of wine on that dress was a drop of blood they would pay back with interest. The party was over, but my work was just beginning. The laughter from the patio had barely subsided when the kitchen door swung open. Mr. Thomas stood there, his back straight despite his 70 years. He had served my grandfather for 40 of them. He had polished the silver, ironed the newspapers, and when my parents died in that car crash, he was the one who made me hot cocoa while I sat on the back steps waiting for them to come home. He looked at Tiffany wiping wine from her dress, and then at me still on the ground among the glass shards. "That is quite enough," Mr. Thomas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried a weight of authority that usually made everyone stop. "Miss Zara is not a servant to be abused. She is a Brooks, and this behavior is beneath the dignity of this house." Darius stopped laughing. He walked over to the old man towering over him. "Excuse me, did the help just speak to me?" "I am speaking to the man who is disgracing his grandfather's memory," Mr. Thomas replied, unflinching. "Otis would be ashamed of you both." Darius's face turned a violent shade of red. "Otis is dead," he spat. "And I am the master of this house now. You are fired. Get your things and get out. Tonight." "You cannot do that," I cried out, scrambling to my feet. "He has a pension. He has lived in the carriage house for 30 years. "Not anymore," Darius sneered. "No pension. No severance. Just the door. Consider it a penalty for insubordination." An hour later, I watched from the shadows of the barn as Mr. Thomas walked down the driveway in the pouring rain. He was carrying a single battered suitcase. It was a sight that broke my heart more than any insult Tiffany could hurl at me. I waited until he reached the end of the lane out of sight from the main house, before I pulled my truck up alongside him. "Get in," I whispered, unlocking the door. He climbed in, shivering, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "I am sorry, Miss Zara," he said, his voice trembling. "I could not watch it anymore." "Hush," I said softly. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out an envelope. It contained the last of my cash savings, everything I bad not spent on cattle feed. "Take this. Go to your sisters in Houston. But do not unpack your bags, Mr. Thomas." He looked at me confused. "Why?" I looked up at the house on the hill where the lights were blazing in celebration of their cruelty. "Because you are not retired," I said, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. "You are just on paid leave. Give me 1 week. Just 1 week. When I call you, put your best suit on. You are going to be the one opening the door for the police." He looked at the money, then at me, and a slow, knowing smile spread across his weathered face. He nodded once. I will keep my uniform pressed, Miss Zara. I watched him board the bus at the station, then drove back to the ranch. The rain beat against the windshield, matching the rhythm of my heart. They had taken the furniture. They had taken the dignity. Now they had taken the only family I had left. Darius had just severed the last tie to his humanity. He thought he was cleaning house, but he had just removed the only person who might have warned him about the storm that was coming. The morning before the engagement party, I made one final attempt to save my family from themselves. I found Auntie Patrice in the sunroom, sitting in my grandfather's favorite wicker chair. She was surrounded by stacks of RSVP cards for the gala, humming a tune to herself, while the ranch crumbled around us. She looked up as I entered, her eyes narrowing slightly when she saw my work boots standing on the freshly polished floor. Auntie, we need to talk, I said, keeping my voice low and respectful. She sighed, dropping a card onto the table. Make it quick, Zara. I have 100 things to do before the caterers arrive. And please do not tell me you are asking for an advance on your wages again. It is unbecoming. It is not about money, I said, stepping closer. It is about Darius. He is planning to sell Big Ben tomorrow night. He is liquidating the breeding stock to pay for this party and his debts. Patrice picked up her teacup, taking a slow, deliberate sip. She did not look shocked. She did not look angry. She looked bored. I know, she said simply. Darius told me his plan. He is pivoting the business model. We do not need those smelly beasts anymore if we are building a resort. It is called Progress, Zara. You should try looking it up sometime. My blood ran cold. She knew. She was not just enabling him, she was complicit. Auntie, that bull is the genetic legacy of this ranch. I pressed, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. Grandfather spent 40 years building that bloodline. If Darius sells him, he is selling the soul of this family. You have to stop him. You are his mother. He listens to you. Patrice set the cup down with a sharp clatter. She stood up, smoothing the front of her silk blouse, and walked over to me. She stopped inches from my face, her perfume cloying and sweet, masking the rot beneath. Let us get one thing straight, she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. This is not your family anymore. This is Darius's ranch. These are Darius's animals. And I am his mother. You are just the poor relation we took in out of pity when your parents died. She poked a finger into my chest, right over my heart. You are a guest here, Zara. A guest who has overstayed her welcome. You are eating our food, sleeping in our barn, and taking up space. So do not you dare tell me how to run my son's inheritance. If he wants to sell every cow on this property to buy Tiffany a diamond tiara, that is his right. I stared at her, looking for any trace of the woman who used to bake me cookies when I was a child. She was gone, consumed by greed and envy. Is that your final word? I asked quietly. You are choosing a quick payout over doing what is right. I am choosing my son, she spat. Now get out of my sight. And if you ruin this party tomorrow, I will personally throw your things onto the highway. I turned and walked out of the sunroom without another word. There were no tears this time. Auntie Patrice had just signed her own eviction notice. I had given her a chance to be a Brooks, to stand for something real. Instead, she chose to be a thief. As I walked back to the barn to iron my suit for the auction, I felt a strange sense of peace. The jury had deliberated, the verdict was guilty, and tomorrow I would be the executioner. The day of the engagement party dawned gray and heavy. The air was thick with humidity and the impending doom of the Brooks dynasty. I spent the afternoon pressing my suit in the tack room, listening to the frantic preparations up on the hill. Catering trucks were arriving. Florists were unloading thousands of white roses. It was a funeral disguised as a celebration. As twilight fell, a black sedan with tinted windows rolled up the driveway, avoiding the main chaos of the front entrance. It parked near the side door of the study. I recognized the car. It belonged to Silas Vane, a crooked real estate developer known for turning heritage ranches into strip malls. I slipped out of the barn and moved through the shadows of the oak trees. My heart was pounding not with fear, but with adrenaline. This was it, the final piece of evidence I needed to seal the trap. I crept up to the side of the house, hiding behind the overgrown azalea bushes that Tiffany had not yet ordered to be ripped out. The study window was open just a crack to let in the evening breeze. I pulled my phone out and pressed record. Inside, Darius was pacing. Vane sat at grandfather's desk looking calm and predatory. "Do you have the paperwork?" Darius asked, his voice tight. Vane slid a blue folder across the mahogany surface. "It is all here, Mr. Brooks. A preliminary sales agreement for the south lot and the riverfront acreage, along with a binding contract for the livestock liquidation. Just sign on the dotted line and the $50,000 cash deposit is yours. The rest will be wired to your account the moment the auction gavel falls tomorrow." Darius did not even read it. He snatched the pen and scribbled his signature with a desperate, frantic energy. He was signing away the earth beneath his feet for a pocket full of cash. "There," he said, shoving the papers back. "It is done. Now give me the money." Vane handed him a thick white envelope. Darius tore it open, thumbing through the stack of $100 bills. The look on his face was pure greed, unadulterated and ugly. I zoomed in with my camera, capturing the signature, the exchange of cash, and the handshake that sealed their conspiracy. They had just committed fraud. Darius had accepted payment for land he did not own, and Vane had knowingly entered into an illegal contract. I stopped the recording and saved the file to 3 different cloud servers. Then I typed a text message to Marcus Thorne. He signed. He took the cash. "We have him." I hit send and watched the little bubble travel across the screen. A moment later, a reply appeared. "The warrant is being drafted. See you at the party." I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked up at the moon rising over the barn. The wait was over. Darius thought he was walking into his coronation. He had no idea he was walking into a cage. I turned and headed back to the barn to dress for the main event. The show was about to begin. The transition from the quiet darkness of the barn back to the blinding lights of the auction hall felt like stepping between 2 different dimensions. I slipped in through a side entrance, my black suit freshly pressed and sharp as a blade. I stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, watching the predator become the prey. Darius was working the room with a manic energy that bordered on desperation. He moved through the crowd of wealthy cattlemen and land developers like a shark that had scented blood, but he was too arrogant to realize that the sharks were actually circling him. He had set up a large easel near the bar, displaying a glossy architectural rendering of his vision. It showed the rolling hills of our pasture paved over with concrete tennis courts and a sprawling glass hotel that looked like a spaceship had crashed into the Texas countryside. "Gentlemen, cattle are the past," Darius proclaimed loud enough for half the room to hear. He clapped a hand on the shoulder of Mr. Sterling, a land developer from Dallas known for his ruthlessness. "Hospitality is the future. Imagine a 5-star eco-resort right here on the river. Yoga retreats, wine tastings. We are talking about tripling the revenue per acre without ever having to touch a shovel of manure." Mr. Sterling swirled his bourbon, looking at the rendering with a mixture of skepticism and greed. "It is a bold plan, son," he said, his voice gravelly. "But that riverfront property is a flood zone, and zoning laws in this county are strict about agricultural preservation. You sure you can get the permits to pour that much concrete?" Darius laughed, waving his hand dismissively. "The zoning board is in my pocket, and as for the flood zone, that is just a detail for the engineers. The point is, I am offering you the land at 40 cents on the dollar. You buy the dirt tonight, and by next year, when the resort breaks ground, your investment will have doubled. It is free money." I watched the men around the circle exchange glances. They were not impressed by Darius's vision or his charm. They were predators looking at a wounded animal. They knew he was selling off prime real estate for a fraction of its value because he needed cash fast. They did not care about his resort, they just wanted the land. "Interesting proposal," another investor said, stepping forward. "And the livestock. I hear you are liquidating the herd to fund this little project." Every last head, Darius confirmed, grinning, including Big Ben. "We are clearing the board tonight. Out with the old, in with the new." I felt a surge of nausea. He was talking about living creatures, about a century of history, as if they were old furniture he was tossing to the curb. He was selling the soul of the Brooks family to pay for a fantasy that would never be built. But as I watched him shake hands, sealing deal after deal on promises he could not keep, I felt my grip on the phone in my pocket tighten. "Enjoy the spotlight, Darius," I whispered. "Keep shaking hands. Keep signing your name. Every promise you make is another link in the chain I am about to wrap around your ankles." The investors looked at him and saw a fool with a lot of land. I looked at him and saw a dead man walking. The auction was about to start, and he had no idea that he was the one on the block. Darius stepped back breathless from his sales pitch and handed the microphone to Tiffany. She did not take it so much as she seized it. The spotlight hit her white dress, making her glow like a false angel. From where I stood in the shadows looking up at the stage, she looked 10 feet tall. A giantess constructed of hairspray and hubris. She waited for the applause to die down, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. She wanted every eye in the room fixed on her. "Thank you, Darius," she said, her voice soft, but amplified to fill every corner of the hall. "It is so inspiring to hear a man speak with such vision. When I first arrived at Brooks Ranch, I must be honest with you all, I was horrified. I saw mud. I saw decay. I saw a way of life that was frankly primitive." She walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at the crowd with a benevolent smile that did not reach her eyes. "For generations, this land has been used for dirty, dangerous work. Raising cattle, mucking stalls. It is a hard life, a gritty life. And let us be honest, it is a life that belongs in history books, not in the modern world. We are doing the humane thing by putting the old Brooks legacy out of its misery." A murmur went through the room. I saw Mr. Henderson frown and cross his arms. He had spent his life in the saddle, and Tiffany had just called his existence a waste of time. But she was too absorbed in her own performance to notice the shift in the room. She gestured dramatically to the covered easel behind her. "It is time to elevate this property. It is time to wash away the dust and bring true sophistication to this county. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Tiffany Springs Resort and Spa." With a theatrical flourish, she yanked the velvet cloth away. Underneath was a large three-dimensional model of the proposed development. It was hideous. A sprawling complex of white concrete and glass that looked like a spaceship had crashed into the Texas countryside. It had tennis courts. It had a yoga pavilion. It had a parking lot where the family cemetery currently stood. The crowd gasped, but not in the way she hoped. It was the gasp of people seeing a car crash, but Tiffany beamed, taking the reaction as awe. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she cooed, running her hand over the plastic model. "No more cows, no more manure, no more of that awful rustic smell. We are bringing civilization to the wilderness. We are bringing class to a place that has desperately needed it for 100 years." I watched her preen in front of the plastic monstrosity. She was not just insulting my family, she was insulting the land itself. She spoke of civilizing us as if we were savages living in the dirt, waiting for her to save us with overpriced lattes and facials. My grip on my phone tightened. She had just insulted every rancher in the room, but more importantly, she had just publicly declared her intent to destroy the very asset she was trying to sell. She was digging her grave with a silver shovel, and she was smiling while she did it. The room went dark, leaving only a single spotlight focused on the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the stage. A low murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd, like the sound of distant thunder. Darius stepped forward, his smile tight, his eyes darting nervously toward the wings. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice booming over the speakers, "you have seen the future in our architectural plans. Now allow me to present the capital that will build it. The crown jewel of the Brooks legacy." The curtains parted with a dramatic swoosh. A collective gasp, Then a hushed silence fell over the room. Led by a handler who looked far too small for the task, Big Ben stepped into the light. He was magnificent. 2,000 pounds of muscle and genetic perfection, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian under the stage lights. But to my eyes, the signs of neglect were visible. His gait was slightly slower than usual, his breathing a little heavier. He tossed his massive head the brass ring in his nose, catching the light, and let out a low, rumbling bellow that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. It wasn't a sound of aggression. It was a sound of confusion. He didn't belong on a stage. He belonged in the pastures I had been banished from. Darius walked over to the bull, keeping a safe distance that betrayed his fear of the animal. He slapped the flank of the beast with a proprietary air that made my stomach turn. This, my friends, is Big Ben, the finest breeding bull in Texas. His bloodline has produced champions for 3 decades. Darius paused for effect, scanning the faces of the wealthy ranchers in the front row. And tonight, he is available to the highest bidder. We are starting the bidding at $500,000. 500,000. It was an insult. A bull of Ben's caliber was worth double that easily. But Darius didn't care about value. He cared about speed. He needed the cash to pay off Vane before the night was over. A hand shot up in the third row. 500. A man in a gray Stetson shouted. 550 called another from the back. 600. The numbers began to fly faster and faster. Darius was practically vibrating with excitement. He looked over at Tiffany, who was clapping her hands in glee, already mentally spending the money. They looked at Big Ben and saw a pile of cash. I looked at him and saw my grandfather's life's work being auctioned off for scrap. I sat in the shadows of the mezzanine, my hand gripping my phone so hard my knuckles turned white. My thumb hovered over the send button on a text drafted to Marcus Thorne. Not yet, I whispered to myself. Wait for the gavel. Wait until the crime is complete. 650 going once. Darius shouted, sweat glistening on his forehead. Do I hear 700, 700? The voice came from Silas Vane himself. He was sitting in the front row, a smug grin plastered on his face. He wasn't even a rancher. He was buying Ben just to liquidate him later, probably to a slaughterhouse to clear the assets for his development deal. Sold to Mr. Silas Vane for $700,000. Darius slammed his fist into his palm, mimicking a gavel since the real auctioneer had been pushed aside. The room erupted in polite applause. Darius and Vane locked eyes and nodded. The deal was done. The fraud was consummated. I took a deep breath, the cold air of the air-conditioned hall filling my lungs. I stood up. It was time. With the livestock liquidated, Darius wasted no time pivoting to the main course. The South Lot. 100 acres of prime riverfront property that my grandfather had intended to be a wildlife sanctuary. Now it was just lines on a map being sold to the highest bidder to become a concrete playground. The bidding opened at $800,000 and immediately the room erupted. The developers smelled a bargain. 800,000 became 900,000 in the blink of an eye. Then, the magic number hit. $1 million. Darius gripped the sides of the podium, his knuckles white not from stress, but from pure adrenaline. He looked like a man who had just discovered fire. 1,200,000, shouted a voice from the back. 1,003,000, 1,004,000. The numbers were flying through the air like confetti. I watched Darius lean away from the microphone, turning his head toward Tiffany, who was standing in the wings. Even from my seat in the shadows, I could read his lips perfectly. We are rich, baby. We are absolutely untouchable. Tiffany brought her hands to her face, her eyes wide and glittering, reflecting the dollar signs. She did not see a river or trees. She saw designer bags and first-class flights. 1,500,000. The bid came from Silas Vane again. He was determined to own every inch of what used to be my home. Darius pointed a shaking finger at him, acknowledging the bid. The room buzzed with energy. It was a fever pitch, a collective hallucination of wealth. Everyone was drunk on the prospect of money. Everyone except me. I sat perfectly still, my phone resting in my lap. Let the number go higher. Let the grand larceny charge climb from a felony to a headline. The higher the price, the longer the sentence. The bidding war for the land had stalled at $1.8 million. Darius was beaming, practically levitating with triumph. He held up a hand to quiet the room, basking in the adoration of the crowd. He nodded to Tiffany, who sashayed back to the microphone, her eyes gleaming with malice. She wasn't content with winning. She needed to twist the knife. "Thank you, everyone, for your incredible generosity," she purred, her voice dripping with faux sweetness. "This money is going to transform Brooks Ranch into a paradise." "But we believe in charity, don't we?" Darius. Darius chuckled into his drink, nodding. "Absolutely, darling." Tiffany scanned the room until her gaze landed on the dark corner of the mezzanine, where I was sitting. A spotlight, clearly prearranged, swung around and blinded me. I blinked against the glare, feeling the weight of 300 pairs of eyes on me. "We have decided," Tiffany announced, her smile widening to show all her teeth, "to set aside a special fund from tonight's proceeds. We are pledging 1%, yes, a whole 1%, to the Zara Brooks Re-Education Fund." The crowd tittered nervously, unsure if this was a joke. "Poor Zara has had a hard time adjusting to the modern world." Tiffany continued, her voice taking on a mocking, pitying tone. "We want to send her back to school, maybe a remedial reading course or perhaps a vocational class on how to clean a toilet properly. We just want to ensure that she doesn't have to spend the rest of her life as a servant. It's the least we can do for family, right?" The room erupted in laughter. It was a cruel, braying sound. The laughter of people who felt safe in their power, mocking the one person they thought couldn't fight back. Darius threw his head back and roared, pointing at me. Even Auntie Patrice, sitting in the front row, allowed a small, tight smile to cross her lips. I sat there, the spotlight burning my retinas. I didn't look away. I didn't flinch. I let the laughter wash over me. I let it seep into my skin and harden my resolve. They were laughing at a ghost. The Zara they thought they knew, the quiet, obedient, broken girl, was gone. In her place sat the owner of everything they were standing on. I stood up slowly. The movement caught the attention of the people nearest to me, and the laughter began to die down, rippling into silence as I walked to the railing of the mezzanine. I looked down at Tiffany, whose smile faltered just a fraction. "Thank you for the offer, Tiffany," I said, my voice projecting clearly without a microphone into the sudden quiet. "But I don't think I'll be needing charity. However, you might want to save that 1%. You're going to need it for your bail money." I turned and walked toward the stairs. The silence in the room was deafening. The trap was sprung. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. It hung over the grand auction hall like a heavy velvet curtain, suffocating the laughter and the mockery that had filled the air only seconds before. I turned from the railing and began my descent from the mezzanine. The spotlight operator seemed confused, the beam of light wavering before finally locking onto me again, but this time it did not feel like an interrogation lamp. It felt like a coronation. I took the stairs one by one. I did not rush. I did not run. I moved with the slow, inevitable momentum of a glacier. All other sound in the room had ceased. There was no clinking of ice in glasses, no whispered gossip, no rustling of programs. There was only the rhythmic percussion of my heels striking the metal steps. Click, click, click. Each step echoed through the cavernous hall like the ticking of a clock counting down to zero. As I reached the ground floor, the crowd parted. These were the same people who had laughed at Tiffany's jokes about my illiteracy. Now they shrank back, pressing themselves against the walls, their eyes wide with confusion. They sensed a shift in the atmosphere. They sensed that the predator had suddenly become the prey, but they could not yet understand how. Darius stood on the stage, his face a mask of furious confusion. He gestured frantically to the side of the room. Miller, the head of the private security firm Darius had hired to replace our loyal ranch hands, stepped out from the shadows. He was a mountain of a man with a neck the size of a tree stump, and he moved to intercept me in the center aisle. He crossed his arms over his chest, blocking my path to the stage. Ms. Brooks Miller rumbled, his voice low and threatening. "You have been asked to leave the premises. Do not make me drag you out." I did not stop walking until I was inches from his chest. I did not look up at him with fear. I looked at him with bored expectation. Without breaking eye contact, I reached into the breast pocket of my blazer. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out a sleek black lanyard holding a platinum identification card encased in hard plastic. It featured the hologram of the Brooks Trust and 3 words printed in gold bold letters. "Chairman of the board." I held it up to his face. "Read it," I said, my voice calm and cold. Miller squinted at the card. He looked at the seal. He looked at the title. Then he looked at me. His eyes widened as the realization hit him. He knew exactly what that card meant. It meant that Darius was not his employer. I was. It meant that every check he had received came from a fund that I controlled. It meant that if he touched me, he would be assaulting the owner of the property he was paid to protect. The color drained from his face. The aggression vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid military discipline. He uncrossed his arms. He stepped back, clearing the path. Then, to the shock of everyone watching, he lowered his head in a respectful bow. "Apologies, ma'am," he said clearly. "Proceed." A collective gasp ripped through the room. Darius's jaw dropped. Tiffany looked as if she had been slapped. I walked past Miller without a second glance. I ascended the stairs to the stage, the sound of my heels now thudding softly on the carpeted steps. I was no longer the poor cousin. I was the storm that had finally made landfall. I stepped into the circle of light that had been reserved for the victors. Darius stood frozen, his hand still clutching the microphone, his knuckles white. He looked at me with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror, like a man waking up from a dream to find a knife at his throat. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to order me off the stage again, but no sound came out. The air between us crackled with a static charge. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't ask. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the stem of the microphone. Darius's grip was tight, a reflex of desperation, but mine was stronger. I locked eyes with him, letting him see the cold, absolute resolve in my gaze. I pulled. It wasn't a struggle. It was a transfer of power. The microphone slipped from his sweaty palm into mine. A sharp screech of feedback pierced the air, causing the front row to wince and cover their ears. It was a violent, ugly sound that severed the last threads of the party's festive atmosphere. I waited for the echo to die down. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning units and the terrified, shallow breathing of my cousins standing inches away. I raised the microphone to my lips. My voice did not tremble. It did not plead. It struck the back of the room like a hammer. "The auction is cancelled," I declared. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Darius snapped out of his trance. He lunged forward, trying to grab the mic back, but I sidestepped him effortlessly. He stumbled, catching himself on the podium, looking foolish and uncoordinated. "She is crazy!" Darius shouted, his voice thin and unamplified, lost in the cavernous hall. "Don't listen to her. She is a disgruntled employee. Security, get her out of here." I turned back to the crowd, ignoring him completely. I looked directly at Silas Vane, who was still holding his winning bid card. "Put your checkbook away, Mr. Vane," I said, my voice booming through the speakers. "And you, Mr. Sterling, tear up those contracts, because the transaction you just witnessed is null and void." I swept my arm toward Darius, who was now frantically signaling to Tiffany for help. "You came here tonight to buy land and livestock from the Brooks estate." I continued, letting my anger simmer just below the surface of my professional tone. "But you have been deceived. You cannot buy property from a man who owns nothing but the suit on his back." A murmur of shock rippled through the crowd. Darius's face turned a mottled shade of purple. "That is a lie," he screamed. "I am the heir. I am the grandson of Otis Brooks." I turned to face him, cutting him off with a glare that froze him in place. I spoke into the microphone, but I was looking deep into his soul. You are a grandson, yes, I said. But you are not the owner. You never were. The man standing beside me is not a businessman. He is not a rancher. He is a fraud. He is a squatter who has been living on borrowed time and spending money that does not belong to him. I looked back at the audience delivering the final blow. Darius Brooks is a thief. And tonight he just tried to sell you stolen goods in front of 300 witnesses. The party is over. Now the law begins. You are insane. Darius screamed the words so loud that his voice cracked, breaking into a high-pitched squeal of panic. He let go of the podium and frantically patted his chest, searching his pockets like a man on fire. The camera movement mirrored his internal chaos, jerking violently as he stumbled back and forth. He looked at the confused faces of the investors, then at the security guards who were standing down, and finally back at me. He needed a weapon, and he found the only one he had left. He ripped a folded document from his inside jacket pocket. It was the handwritten will, the forgery he had used to steal my life. He waved it in the air, the paper crinkling loudly in the microphone's silence. "Look at this!" he shouted, thrusting the paper toward the front row. "Read it. Read the date. Otis Brooks left everything to me. It is right here in black and white. I have the deed. I have the title. I am the legal owner of this ranch, and this woman is trespassing on my stage." He turned to me, shaking the paper in my face. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and desperate. "You think you can just walk up here and say a few words and take this from me? You are nobody, Zara. You are a servant. This piece of paper says I am the king. This is the law." I looked at the piece of yellow legal pad paper fluttering in his trembling hand. It looked pathetic. A flimsy lie that had held up for weeks only because no one had challenged it. I did not recoil. I did not step back. I leaned in closer to the microphone, my expression shifting from cold anger to pitying amusement. "That is not the law, Darius," I said, my voice smooth and deadly. "That is a rough draft." Darius froze, the paper still held aloft. "What?" I gestured to the document with a dismissive flick of my hand. "You are waving that around like it is a shield. But honestly, it is embarrassing. Is that what you use to wipe your boots on before you come into the house? Because that is about all it is good for." The crowd let out a low gasp. Darius looked at the paper, then at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "It is a will," he stammered, but the conviction was draining out of him. "It is notarized." "It is a scrap of paper," I corrected, "and it is irrelevant. Because you cannot inherit what did not belong to Otis Brooks when he died. You are holding a claim to a ghost, Darius. Grandfather moved every asset into a trust 5 years ago. He did not own the land, he did not own the house, he did not own the cattle. The trust owns everything." I paused, letting the reality sink in. "And that piece of paper you are holding is just evidence of your own stupidity. You forged a will for an estate that did not legally exist. You have been playing make-believe, and now school is out." Darius looked down at the paper in his hand. His fingers went slack. The document slipped from his grasp and drifted to the floor, landing near his expensive Italian shoes. He looked small. He looked defeated. But I was not done with him yet. I wanted him to understand the full extent of his failure before I let the police take him away. The heavy double doors at the back of the auction hall swung open with a boom that sounded like a gunshot. A blinding white light from the exterior floodlights poured into the room, creating 3 long, menacing shadows that stretched all the way to the stage. The silhouettes moved forward, marching in perfect synchronization down the center aisle. As they stepped out of the glare and into the ambient light of the hall, the room fell deathly silent. Leading the phalanx was Marcus Thorne, the corporate shark I had met in Houston. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Darius's car and carried a thick leather briefcase. To his right walked Sheriff Tate, the elected lawman of this county, his hand resting casually on his belt near his holster. To his left was Mr. Abernathy, the senior vice president of the regional bank, holding a ledger that looked ominously heavy. They did not look like guests. They looked like an execution squad. Darius squinted into the light shielding his eyes. "Who is that?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "This is a private event. You cannot just barge in here." Thorn did not break stride until he reached the base of the stage. He looked up at Darius with the expression of an exterminator looking at a particularly stubborn cockroach. Then he turned to the crowd, raising his voice so it carried to the rafters. "I am Marcus Thorn, representing the legal interests of the Brooks estate, and I am here to correct a significant clerical error that has been entertaining you all evening." He placed his briefcase on a nearby table and snapped the latches open. The sound echoed in the quiet room. He pulled out a blue binder stamped with a gold seal and held it up for everyone to see. "Mr. Brooks here has been operating under the assumption that he inherited this land through a handwritten will," Thorn announced, his tone dry and professional. "However, that document is legally impossible. You cannot inherit what the deceased did not own." Darius sputtered, gripping the podium. "Grandfather owned this land. Everyone knows that." "Incorrect," Thorn said sharply. 5 years ago, Otis Brooks dissolved his personal ownership of the ranch. He transferred the deed, the livestock, and all liquid assets into a limited liability corporation known as the ZB Legacy Trust. Thorn opened the binder and pointed to the signature line on the bottom of the first page. The sheriff stepped forward, standing next to Thorn, his presence adding the weight of the law to the lawyer's words. The sheriff took the microphone that I offered down to him. "I have reviewed the filings with the county clerk," he said, his voice rough and authoritative. "The paperwork is in order. The transfer of title was recorded and finalized in 2019. Thorn snapped the binder shut and looked directly at Darius. "The sole beneficiary and managing trustee of that corporation is Ms. Zara Brooks. She has been the legal owner of this property for 5 years. She is not the heir, Darius. She is your landlord. And frankly, you are behind on the rent." A gasp went through the room. It was not a gasp of shock this time, but of realization. The investors looked from me to Darius, connecting the dots. The servant girl had been holding the keys to the kingdom the entire time. Darius looked like he had been punched in the gut. He sagged against the podium, his legs giving way as the foundation of his reality crumbled beneath him. The king was dead. Long live the queen. The metallic click of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the loudest sound in the room. It cut through the stunned silence like a guillotine blade dropping. Sheriff Tate did not be gentle. He spun Darius around and wrenched his arms behind his back, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had waited too long to clean up a mess. The cold steel bit into Darius's wrists, pinching the skin, and finally breaking the trance of arrogance that had protected him for weeks. Darius Brooks, the sheriff, bellowed, his voice projecting to the back of the hall without a microphone. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and the attempted sale of stolen property. We have digital evidence that you accepted a $50,000 wire transfer for land you do not own. You also signed a contract to liquidate assets that belong to the ZB Legacy Trust." Darius began to hyperventilate. His knees buckled, and 2 deputies had to step in to hold him upright. The confident, slick cattle baron who had stood on that stage 5 minutes ago was gone. In his place was a terrified child. Tears streamed down his face, mixing with the sweat and the expensive bronzer he wore. "No, wait, please." Darius stammered, his head whipping back and forth. "There is a mistake. I did not know. I thought the will was real. You have to believe me, Sheriff. I am a victim here." The sheriff tightened his grip. "Save it for the judge, son. You have the right to remain silent." Darius's eyes darted wildly around the room until they landed on Tiffany. She was standing at the edge of the stage, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. She took a step back, trying to distance herself from the blast radius. But Darius was drowning, and he was not going to sink alone. "It was her," he screamed, struggling against the deputies. He thrust his chin toward Tiffany. "It was all her idea. She made me do it. She needed the money for the renovations. She told me to forge the will. She said no one would check. The crowd gasped. The betrayal was absolute and instantaneous. Tiffany dropped her hands, her face twisting in shock. "You liar!" she shrieked, her voice shrill and piercing. "I had nothing to do with this. You told me you owned the place. You told me you were rich. She pushed me." Darius wailed, his snot running down onto his silk tie. "She threatened to leave me if I did not buy her the cars and the clothes. I did it for her. Arrest her too. Do not let her walk away. She is the mastermind." I watched from the center of the stage, my expression unmoving. It was pathetic. There was no loyalty among thieves. The moment the pressure was applied, their love story disintegrated into a finger-pointing match. The deputies began to drag Darius toward the exit. He kicked his legs, his expensive dress shoes scuffing the floor he had just tried to sell. "I am a Brooks," he sobbed, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "You cannot do this to me. I have rights. Tiffany, help me. Call my mother. Somebody help me." No one moved. The investors, the friends, the neighbors, they all watched with cold detachment. They had seen the evidence. They had seen the true nature of the man. As Darius was hauled through the double doors and into the night, leaving a trail of humiliation in his wake, I felt a heavy weight lift off my shoulders. The king had fallen, and he had dragged his queen down into the mud with him. Darius's screams had barely faded down the hallway when Tiffany attempted her escape. She smoothed her wine-stained dress and offered a tremulous, teary smile to the room, attempting to pivot from accomplice to survivor. She took a step toward the stairs, her heels clicking softly on the stage. "I was just a pawn," she sobbed loudly enough for the front row to hear. "He deceived me too. I had no idea he was doing anything illegal. I am just a girl from the city who fell in love with the wrong man." She almost made it to the stairs. She almost convinced them. But I was not about to let the architect of my misery walk away with her reputation intact. "Not so fast, Tiffany," I said, my voice stopping her dead in her tracks. "Darius was a thief, yes. But you were the demolition crew. You want these people to believe you respect our traditions. You want them to think you are a victim. Let us see what you really think of Brooks Ranch." I signaled to the tech crew in the booth at the back of the room. I had prepared this reel days ago, anticipating this exact moment. The massive LED screen behind me, which had displayed the lying render of the resort, flickered and went black. A second later, it roared to life with high-definition video. The audio boomed through the speakers, crisp and clear. It was footage from the security cameras I had installed in the main house years ago, cameras Tiffany had been too self-absorbed to notice. On screen, Tiffany was standing in the hallway holding a portrait of grandfather Otis. She looked at it with pure disgust. "Look at this old goat," she sneered on the video. "God, he looks like a savage. Get this trash out of my house. I do not want dead rednecks staring at me while I eat." The room went deadly silent. The wealthy ranchers, the cattle barons, the men and women who prided themselves on their lineage stared at the screen in horror. To call Otis Brooks a savage was to insult every single person in that room who had known and respected him. The video cut to another clip. Tiffany was in the library sweeping armfuls of first edition books into a garbage bag. "Burn it all," she commanded, her voice shrill. "If it smells like cows or history, I want it gone. We are scrubbing the stench of this family off the walls. I want this place to look like Miami, not some dusty Texas hellhole." On stage, the real Tiffany stood frozen under the giant projection of her own malice. Her face drained of color. She looked out at the audience pleadingly, but the pity had evaporated. In its place was a wall of cold hostility. These people loved their land, they loved their history, and they had just watched an outsider call it trash. A low boo started from the back of the room. It spread quickly, growing into a roar of disapproval. "Shame," someone shouted. "Get off the stage," another voice yelled. Tiffany backed away from the audience, shaking her head. "No, that was taken out of context. You do not understand." I walked over to her, standing calmly, amidst the chorus of jeers. They understand perfectly, I said, leaning in close so only she could hear. They know exactly who you are now. You are not a victim, Tiffany. You are a vandal. And in Texas, we do not take kindly to people who disrespect the dead. Get out of my house before I have the sheriff add you to the booking sheet. She did not need to be told twice. She scrambled off the stage, shielding her face from the flashing cameras of the local press, running through the gauntlet of angry ranchers who parted only to let her flee into the night. She was not in handcuffs, but her social sentence had been passed. She was exiled. Tiffany scrambled toward the exit, but the crowd was dense and unforgiving. They formed a human wall blocking her path not with physical force, but with cold shoulders and turned backs. She was trapped in the purgatory of her own making. I descended the stairs from the stage, moving with a calm lethality. I caught up to her near the velvet ropes, where she stood shivering and clutching her purse like a life raft. I reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. It was a light touch, but she flinched as if I had burned her. She spun around, her mascara running in black rivulets down her cheeks, ruining the heavy foundation she wore like armor. Her eyes were wide and feral, darting around for an escape route that did not exist. Please, she whimpered, her voice barely a whisper. I am leaving. I am going. Just let me pass. I leaned in close, invading her personal space until my lips were inches from her ear. The room around us was still buzzing with the aftermath of the exposure, but in this small pocket of air, it was just the two of us. You are leaving, yes, I said, my voice low and steady. But we are not done, Tiffany. You think you can just walk away after treating my home like your personal trash can? You are mistaken. She blinked, confused. What do you want? I have nothing. Darius has all the money. I smiled, a cold, humorless expression. I know you have nothing, but you do have a debt. Remember that mahogany dining table you had thrown in the dumpster? The one you said smelled like old people. That was a custom piece from the 19th century, valued at $50,000. Her breath hitched, and the hand-woven rugs. I continued ticking items off on my fingers. The first edition library books you burned, the structural damage from your unauthorized renovations. I have the receipts, Tiffany. I have the appraisals, and I have the video evidence of you ordering their destruction. I paused, letting the numbers hang in the air. My lawyers are filing a civil suit for destruction of private property first thing in the morning. By my estimation, you owe the Brooks estate roughly $200,000. And since you are not married to Darius, his debts are his, but your vandalism is yours alone. 200,000, she gasped. I cannot pay that. I will be bankrupt. Exactly, I whispered. You will be working for a very long time to pay me back. Maybe you can find a job cleaning toilets. I hear you have a unique perspective on hygiene. Now you have exactly 30 minutes to get your things and get off my property. Anything left in the house at midnight belongs to me. Tick-tock. I pulled back and looked her in the eye. The fight went out of her completely. Her knees gave way and she sank to the floor in a heap of white silk and misery. She did not scream, she did not argue. She simply broke under the weight of the bill she could not pay. I stepped over her, avoiding the puddle of her dress spreading on the floor, and walked toward the exit where the sheriff was waiting. The house was finally clean. The chaos of the arrest had settled into a grim reality. The flashing lights of the police cruisers were visible through the open doors, painting the walls in rhythmic strokes of red and blue. I turned to leave the stage, my work finally finished, but a figure burst through the line of bewildered security guards. It was Auntie Patrice. She was no longer the composed matriarch who had sipped tea in the sunroom while dismissing my existence. Her hair was wild, escaping its pins, and her face was a mask of sheer terror. She did not stop until she reached me. She threw herself at my feet, clutching the hem of my trousers like a beggar in the street. The sound of her knees hitting the hard wood of the stage echoed in the quiet hall. "Zara, please," she wailed, her voice cracking. "You have to stop them. You have to call the sheriff back. He is your blood. He is my only son. You cannot let him go to prison. He will not survive in there." I looked down at the woman who had raised me after my parents died. I searched my heart for a flicker of pity or a spark of the love I once held for her. I found nothing. There was only a cold, hollow silence. She looked up at me, her eyes swimming in tears, mascara running down the deep lines of her face. "He made a mistake, Zara," she pleaded, pulling at my leg. "He is young. He was influenced by that awful girl. Just drop the charges, please. We can fix this. We can be a family again. I will make him apologize. Just do not destroy him." I stepped back, pulling my leg free from her grasping hands. She scrambled forward on her knees, reaching for me again, but I held up a hand to stop her. The gesture was sharp and final. "Do not talk to me about blood, Auntie," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "2 days ago I came to you. I stood right in front of you and begged you to stop him. I told you he was selling the soul of this family. I asked for your help." Patrice sobbed, covering her mouth with her trembling hand. I know I was wrong." I shook my head. "You were not just wrong. You were cruel. You told me I was a guest in my own home. You said I was eating your food and taking up space. You chose him, Patrice. You saw a thief and you saw a golden ticket. You bet on him because you thought he would make you rich, and you thought I was nothing." I leaned down slightly, not to comfort her, but to ensure she heard every word. "You picked your side. You signed off on his crimes with your silence. And now you want me to save you from the consequences of your own greed. That is not how this works. You wanted him to be the master of the house. Well, now he is the master of a federal prison cell." "But I am your aunt," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I am all you have left." I looked out at the empty hall, at the land beyond the walls that was finally safe. "No, Auntie," I said, straightening up. "I have the ranch, I have the legacy, and I have my dignity. That is more than enough." I stepped around her, leaving her kneeling on the cold stage floor, sobbing into the empty air. I walked toward the exit, the sound of her weeping fading behind me with every step. I did not look back. There was nothing behind me worth saving. The future was waiting out in the cool night air, and I was finally free to meet it. The visiting room smelled of bleach and unwashed bodies, a sharp chemical tang that stuck to the back of my throat. I sat on the metal stool, my hands folded calmly on the scarred stainless steel ledge. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a constant headache-inducing drone that seemed designed to break the spirit. On the other side of the thick plexiglass, the heavy steel door buzzed open. Darius shuffled in. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big, hanging off his frame like a sack. The swagger was gone. The expensive haircut was gone, replaced by a greasy, matted mess. He looked 10 years older than he had on the stage just 3 days ago. When he saw me, his eyes lit up with a desperate, frantic hope. He practically fell into the chair opposite me, grabbing the receiver phone with trembling hands. "Zara," he breathed, pressing the phone hard against his ear. "Thank God. I knew you would come. I knew you wouldn't leave family to rot in here." I picked up my receiver slowly, my movements deliberate. I did not smile. I did not frown. I looked at him with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining a specimen in a jar. "You look tired, Darius," I said, my voice flat. "It is a nightmare in here," he whispered, leaning closer to the glass as if he could push through it. "The food is inedible. The noise never stops. And the people. Zara, you have to get me out. The judge set bail at 200,000. I know you have access to the trust now. Just post the bond. I will sign whatever you want. I will leave the state. Just get me out." He was still bargaining. He still thought this was a negotiation. He truly believed that after everything he had done, I was there to be his savior. The level of delusion was almost impressive. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I held it up so he could see the legal seal on the front. "I am not here to pay your bail, Darius," I said. "I am here to ensure you do not get it." He froze the receiver, slipping slightly in his sweaty grip. "What is that?" I slid the envelope against the glass. "This is a civil suit." We are filing for damages. Restitution for the embezzlement of ranch funds over the last 6 months, plus a separate suit for the intentional devaluation of the livestock. Darius stared at the envelope, his mouth opening and closing silently. You see, I continued, my voice hardening. The wire fraud charge was federal. That is what got you arrested. But this is personal. This freezes every asset you have left. It alerts the court that you are a flight risk and a financial liability. I just spoke to the district attorney before I came here. With these new filings, they are revoking your bail eligibility. Revoking, he squeaked. You are not going home, Darius. Not today, not tomorrow. My lawyers estimate that with the federal charges and the civil suits stacked on top of each other, you are looking at a minimum mandatory sentence. I leaned in, staring directly into his terrified eyes. 5 years, Darius. You are going to be in this cage for at least 5 years. By the time you get out, the world will have moved on. The ranch will be thriving, and you will be nothing more than a bad memory. He slammed his fist against the glass, the sound a dull thud. You can't do this. I am your cousin. You are heartless. I stood up, smoothing the front of my blazer. I am not heartless. I am just a good businesswoman cleaning up a liability. I hung the phone back on the cradle, cutting off his screaming. I watched him mouth the words, "I will kill you," and "help me," in the same breath, spitting as he yelled at the glass. I turned my back on him and walked toward the exit. The heavy metal door buzzed open for me, leading out into the sunshine. Behind me, the guard stepped forward to drag Darius back to his cell. The door clanged shut, sealing the tomb. Justice had been served. The blue light of the smartphone screen was the only illumination in the cramped motel room where Tiffany had taken refuge. She lay on the lumpy mattress, staring at the device with bloodshot eyes, unable to look away from the disaster unfolding in the palm of her hand. The video Zara had played on the big screen had not stayed in the auction hall. Someone had recorded the projection and uploaded it to Twitter within minutes. By morning, it had 5 million views. By noon, it was the #1 trending topic globally. The comments rolled in faster than she could read them, a relentless waterfall of judgment. Hashtag Token Savage was trending alongside hashtag Trashy Tiffany. Strangers from countries she could not find on a map were dissecting her appearance, her voice, and her cruelty. They called her a colonizer. They called her a vandal. They called her everything she had secretly feared she might be. Her finger hovered over the delete account button, but she could not press it. She was addicted to the pain. She watched a reaction video from a famous historian who dismantled her comments about the library books with icy precision. She watched a TikTok of a teenager mocking her speech, wearing a blonde wig and smearing clown makeup on their face. The internet had turned her into a meme, a caricature of entitlement that would live forever in the cloud. The phone vibrated in her hand, startling her. It was her talent agency, the agency that had promised her a lifestyle brand and a reality show pilot. She answered, her voice trembling with a desperate hope that they might have a strategy to fix this. "Tiffany, we are terminating your contract effective immediately," the agent said, his voice devoid of the fake warmth he usually used. "But wait," she pleaded, sitting up. "We can spin this. I can do an apology tour. I can cry on camera. People love a redemption arc." "You do not understand," the agent cut her off, sharp and cold. "You are radioactive. The beauty line pulled their sponsorship an hour ago. The fashion label just sent a cease and desist letter demanding you stop tagging them in your posts. No one wants to touch you. You are bad for business. Do not call us again." The line went dead. She stared at the screen as the signal bars faded. A notification popped up from Instagram. It was a post from one of the women who had been at the tea party just days ago. The woman who had laughed the loudest when Tiffany mocked Zara. The photo showed the woman looking sad and contemplative, holding a cup of tea. The caption read, "I am absolutely heartbroken to learn about the behavior of my former acquaintance Tiffany. I had no idea she held such hateful views. I stand with the Brooks family and the beautiful history of our community. Love wins. Not my friend." Tiffany screamed, a raw, guttural sound of pure rage, and hurled the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a satisfying crack, but the silence that followed was even worse. They had abandoned her. The moment the ship started sinking, the rats had jumped off and pretended they had never been on board. She was alone. 2 hours later, she was driving her leased convertible, which she would soon lose, down a street she had sworn never to return to. It was a subdivision of beige, split-level houses with overgrown lawns and fading paint. It was the definition of mediocre. It was home. Her father was waiting in the driveway, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not look angry. He looked exhausted. He looked at the suitcases piled in the passenger seat of the convertible and shook his head. "I told you to be humble," her father said as she stepped out of the car. "I told you that high society life would chew you up." "I do not need a lecture, Dad," she snapped, though the bite was gone from her voice. "I just need a place to sleep until the lawsuit blows over." He grabbed the handle of her Louis Vuitton suitcase, dragging it across the cracked pavement. "It is not going to blow over, Tiffany. I saw the video. Your mother saw the video. The neighbors saw the video. You embarrassed us." He led her not to her old bedroom, which had been converted into a sewing room, but to the door under the stairs, the basement. "It is the only space we have," he said, opening the door. The air that wafted up was musty, damp, and cold. It smelled of unfinished concrete and regret. "You cannot be serious," she whispered, looking into the dark. "I cannot live in a basement. I am a brand." "You are unemployed," her father said firmly, "and you are lucky we are letting you in at all after the way you spoke about hardworking people. Down you go." Tiffany dragged her heavy bags down the wooden steps. The single bare bulb flickered, illuminating a stained futon and a stack of old cardboard boxes. There were no windows, there was no view of the river, there was no luxury resort. She sat on the edge of the futon and pulled her cracked phone from her pocket. She refreshed her feed one last time. A new comment had just been posted on her profile. It was from Zara. It was not a gloat. It was not an insult. It was a single link to a job application for a janitorial service. Tiffany stared at the screen until the battery died, plunging her into darkness. She curled up on the futon, pulling her knees to her chest, and for the first time in years, she cried not for an audience, but for the absolute total destruction of the world she had tried to steal. The internet never forgets, and now neither would she. The house was finally silent, but it was no longer the empty, sterile silence of a museum. It was the expectant hush of a patient waiting to be healed. For weeks I had walked through hallways that felt alien to me. Tiffany had painted everything a blinding clinical white, covering up a century of history with a coat of cheap latex. She had tried to erase the soul of the ranch to turn it into a backdrop for her social media feed. Now it was time to peel back the mask and let the house breathe again. I did not hire a standard construction crew. I hired a team of artisan restoration specialists, men and women, who treated wood like living tissue. They arrived at dawn with heat guns, sanders, and gentle solvents. The air filled with the smell of sawdust and varnish, replacing the chemical stench of Tiffany's cleaning products. I watched as the foreman, a man named Elias, with hands like tree roots, started on the main staircase. He ran a heat gun over the banister. The white paint bubbled and curled, peeling away like dead skin. Underneath, the rich, dark grain of the original mahogany began to emerge. It was a deep reddish brown, polished by the oils of 1,000 hands that had gripped it over the decades. My grandfather's hands. My father's hands. And now mine. Seeing that wood come back to life felt like watching a pulse return to a body that had been clinically dead. "Careful right there, Elias," I said, stepping closer. "That newel post has a notch carved in the back. I made it with a pocket knife when I was 7. Elias smiled, revealing the notch as he scraped away the last of the white paint. "It is still here, Miss Brooks. Just needed a little air." While the crew worked on the bones of the house, I went to the carriage house where Tiffany had banished the clutter. It was a pile of exiled memories. She had thrown heirloom quilts into trash bags. She had stacked first edition books in damp cardboard boxes. She had treated the artifacts of my family's life as if they were contagious. I found the portrait of Grandfather Otis leaning against a rusty tractor. The frame was chipped, and there was a small tear in the canvas near the corner where Tiffany had carelessly tossed it. I ran my finger over the damage. I decided then and there that I would not repair that tear. It was a scar. It was part of the history now, a reminder of the time we almost lost everything. I carried the painting back to the main house myself, refusing help. The weight of the heavy gilded frame strained my arms, but it felt good. It felt like penance for not stopping them sooner. I walked into the living room where the walls had just been stripped and stained back to their original warm honey oak tone. I climbed the ladder and hung Otis back above the stone fireplace. As I stepped back, the afternoon sun streamed through the uncurtained windows, hitting the oil paint. For a moment, it looked like the old man blinked. The stern expression he wore seemed to soften as if he recognized the room again. He was no longer staring at a Miami nightclub lobby. He was looking at his home. For the next 3 days, I worked alongside the crew. We brought the Persian rugs back in, rolling them out over the newly polished floors. The intricate patterns of red and gold warmed the room instantly, absorbing the echo and making the space feel intimate again. We restocked the library shelving, the leather-bound volumes that smelled of vanilla and tobacco. I placed grandfather's favorite reading chair back in its spot by the window, angling it perfectly to catch the view of the pastures. When the last workman packed up his tools and drove away, the sun was setting. The house was no longer bright and white. It was filled with shadows and textures. It was imperfect. The floors creaked, the wood had knots, the rugs were worn in the center. But it was real. I walked through the rooms, trailing my hand along the walls, feeling the vibration of the house. It felt heavy and grounded. The sterile plastic atmosphere was gone, replaced by the gravity of heritage. I walked to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, using the old percolator, not the fancy espresso machine Tiffany had bought. The smell of the coffee drifted through the house, mingling with the scent of lemon oil and beeswax. I sat in the living room watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of light that hit the portrait. The house was not just a structure of timber and stone. It was a witness. It had seen my family rise, it had seen us fall, and now it had seen us return. I took a sip of coffee and closed my eyes. The nightmare was over. We were awake and the foundation was solid once more. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the morning silence, but this time it was not the aggressive roar of a sports car or the wail of a police siren. It was the rhythmic rattle of the county bus, the same vehicle that had carried the last member of my family away on that rainy night. I stood on the porch steps, my hands clasped together to hide the tremor in my fingers. The bus doors hissed open and a pair of polished black shoes stepped onto the dust. Mr. Thomas stood there, his back as straight as a rod, wearing his signature black suit and a bow tie that was knotted with mathematical precision. He did not look like a man who had been fired and evicted. He looked like a general returning to his post after a brief leave of absence. He looked up at the house, his eyes scanning the newly restored wood and the open windows before finally landing on me. A small, rare smile touched his lips, an expression of quiet pride that said more than 1,000 words. "Welcome home, Mr. Thomas," I said, my voice thick with emotion. He walked up the steps and bowed his head in his customary greeting, but his eyes remained warm. "I see you have returned Mr. Otis's portrait to its rightful place," he said softly. "The house has its soul back, Miss Zara. I shall go to the kitchen and prepare lunch immediately." I reached out and took his weathered hand, stopping him. "No one is working today, Mr. Thomas, and we need to talk about the new contracts. I have sent letters to every single staff member Darius fired. Everyone is being rehired effective immediately, but the terms have changed. You are all coming back at double your previous salary with full medical benefits for life. This is not charity. It is restitution for the disrespect you endured." He looked at me, his old eyes glistening with sudden moisture. He nodded once, a deep, slow nod that acknowledged the restoration of dignity was worth far more than the money. By late afternoon, the backyard of Brooks Ranch was transformed. Gone were the delicate white linens and the cucumber sandwiches of Tiffany's tea party. In their place was the thick, savory smell of hickory smoke, rising from the massive iron BBQ pit. Slabs of ribs sizzled alongside ears of corn, and galvanized tubs filled with ice and beer were scattered across the grass. The staff had returned. Mr. Henderson, the head of the cattle crew, was holding a cold beer and laughing loudly with the younger ranch hands. The kitchen staff were manning the grill, flipping burgers and shouting jokes over the twang of classic country music blasting from an old radio. There were no evening gowns, no fake compliments, just the sound of boots on grass and the roar of genuine laughter. I stood on the porch, a plate of ribs in my hand, looking out at the scene. This was the true heartbeat of the ranch. It wasn't the land deed or the bank account, it was the community. Mr. Thomas stood beside me sipping a glass of iced tea, watching the festivities with a satisfied expression. "You did it, Miss Zara," he said quietly. "Mr. Otis is definitely smiling today." I looked out toward the pastures where Big Ben was grazing peacefully in the distance. Darius and Tiffany had tried to turn this place into a soulless resort, but they had failed because they didn't understand what they were buying. They thought they were buying dirt. I knew I was protecting a family. I raised my bottle in a silent toast to the people on the lawn, vowing that as long as I drew breath, no one would ever threaten this home again. The last embers of the barbecue pit had faded into gray ash, and the sun was beginning its final descent behind the western ridge. The sky was a bruised purple and gold painting, the pastures in a light so beautiful it made your chest ache. The guests had all gone home, leaving only the crickets to fill the silence. I sat in Grandfather's high-backed oak rocking chair on the front porch. It was the same chair he had sat in every evening for 40 years watching over his herd. Now it was mine. I pushed off the floorboards with my boot, setting a slow, steady rhythm. Squeak, thud, squeak, thud. It was the heartbeat of the house. I took a sip of black coffee and let my eyes trace the fence line down to the river. For weeks I had fought a war on this very ground. I had fought against greed, against stupidity, and against the erasure of my family's history, and I had won. But as the adrenaline faded, I was left with a clarity that was colder and sharper than victory. I stopped rocking. I set the coffee mug down on the railing. I turned my head slowly until I was looking directly into the lens breaking the invisible wall between my world and yours. You saw them, didn't you? Darius and Tiffany. You saw the cars they drove and the clothes they wore. You saw the way they sneered at the dirt and treated people like disposable cutlery. They walked through this life convinced that they were the main characters. They thought that because they had the loudest voices and the shiniest toys, they were better. They thought they had class. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees. But they were confused. They thought class was something you could buy at a boutique. They thought it was a label on a handbag or a number in a bank account. They thought if they covered this old farmhouse in white paint and filled it with modern furniture, it would make them sophisticated. But all they did was put a costume on a corpse. Real class is not about what you own. It is about what you protect. I gestured toward the barn, where the warm yellow light of the heat lamps was just flicking on. It is about knowing the name of every person who works for you and treating them with the dignity of a king. It is about waking up at 3 a.m. to feed a sick calf because that life is your responsibility. It is about understanding that you do not inherit land to cash it out. You inherit it to safeguard it for the next generation. Darius looked at a century-old oak tree and saw lumber. Tiffany looked at a library of first editions and saw clutter. That is not just ignorance. That is poverty. A poverty of the soul that no amount of money can ever fix. They were so busy trying to look rich that they never realized how cheap they had become. I sat back in the chair, resuming the slow, rhythmic rocking. They are gone now, chasing their hollow dreams in prison cells and basements. But the land remains. The roots go deep here, deeper than their greed could ever reach. We cleaned up their mess. We stripped away their pretension. And what we are left with is the truth. I looked out at the horizon one last time as the sun slipped below the earth. You can buy a suit, you can buy a title, you can even buy a judge if you are desperate enough, but you cannot buy the respect of a place like this. You have to earn it, and earning it takes dirty hands and a clean conscience. That is the only legacy worth keeping. The screen fades to black. The morning air was crisp and smelled of damp earth and sweet clover. It was the scent of a land that had healed. I walked into the stable not as a shadow slipping in to steal medicine for a dying animal, but as the owner inspecting her stock. I saddled the chestnut mare with the practiced ease of a woman who had been born in the saddle. She nickered softly, nudging my pocket for an apple, and I obliged. There was no rush today. There was no crisis to avert, no creditor to outrun, and no family member to manage. There was only the work. I mounted up and guided the mare out into the sunlight. The transformation of the ranch was miraculous. The scars left by the heavy machinery from the aborted construction project were gone, covered by a fresh carpet of emerald grass. The fences stood straight and white, gleaming against the horizon. The silence that had once been heavy with dread was now filled with the natural symphony of the plains. The wind in the oak trees, the call of the meadowlarks, and the steady rhythmic thud of hooves on soil. I urged the mare into a canter, moving toward the north pasture. The wind whipped through my hair, blowing away the last lingering memories of the courtroom and the jailhouse. We crested the ridge, and there they were, the herd. They were no longer the rib-thin, ghostly figures that had haunted my nightmares. They were heavy, sleek, and strong. Big Ben stood in the center of them, a king surrounded by his court, his coat shining like polished mahogany. He lifted his head as I approached, acknowledging me not with fear but with recognition. We had survived the famine together, and now we were feasting. I slowed the horse to a walk, stopping at the highest point of the ridge. From here, I could see everything. The river winding like a silver ribbon through the trees, the main house standing proud and restored in the distance, the long driveway that was no longer a runway for vanity projects, but a road that led home. The camera begins to pull back, slowly rising higher and higher into the sky. My figure on the horse becomes smaller, a solitary guardian watching over a vast kingdom. The perspective shifts from the intimate details of the rider to the breathtaking scale of the ranch. The green pastures roll out in every direction, stretching as far as the eye can see. The scars are invisible from up here. The drama, the betrayal, and the noise are all swallowed by the immense enduring beauty of the land. The music swells a soaring orchestral score that speaks of resilience and triumph. It is a sound that matches the grandeur of the Texas sky. I am just a speck in the landscape now, but I am the anchor that holds it all together. I did not need to shout to win. I did not need to boast. I simply needed to outlast them. The screen fades slowly to black, leaving only the music echoing in the void. Then white letters appear in the center of the darkness. Never underestimate the quiet ones. The saga of Brooks Ranch serves as a timeless reminder that true class cannot be bought. It is earned through stewardship and integrity. While Darius and Tiffany chased the illusion of status with noise and arrogance, Zara demonstrated that real power lies in silence, observation, and an unwavering loyalty to one's roots. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the strongest, and those who underestimate the quiet ones often do so at their own peril. Dignity is not a costume you wear, it is the foundation you build. Share this story if you believe integrity always wins in the end.